Okay, now we are ready for the second presentation of today, and I am very, very pleased to introduce to you Paolo Fonda. I was so privileged to meet you, Paolo, just 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, in your hometown in Trieste, in Italy. And it was a great day and conversation about individual trauma and memory, collective trauma and memory. And I could have talked to you for hours and hours, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk now. If I might shortly introduce you, you have the shortest presentation of all of your biography on the internet, on our webpage, and at the same time, I know you are one of the most well-known experts in this field, which we are also going to hear about you today. So for 10 years, you have been the chief psychiatrist in public mental health service. Since 1919, you have worked only as a psychoanalyst and training analyst of the Italian Psychoanalytic Society and International Psychoanalytic Association. From 2002 to 2014, you also have been the director of the Psychoanalytic Institute for Eastern Europe. And as we all know, you are in an area where there have been many wars, where there are still ongoing silenced memories, conflicts, the floor is yours. We are looking very much forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Catherine, for this kind presentation. And I thank also the UN organizers for this invitation. Yesterday, I had very interesting and also touching presentations. And today's presentation was very interesting for me because it's very close to the theme I'm treating. Well, I will speak a bit about our psychical apparatus, let's say, during war. How does it react? How does it work? In some aspect of this. But especially wars produce massive traumas in individuals as well as in groups. And so we have to speak also their possible transmission to following generations. And at the end, I will just outline some hypotheses on how all this may influence large groups like nations on how all this they act. Well, wars are, let's start. Wars are extremely complex phenomena caused by many factors. I don't want to tell that wars are determined only on a psychological level, of course, because there are political, social, economic, historical elements that are very important. I wish just to focus our attention on the fact that the psychological aspects too exist and play a role in determining events and their consequences. Let's think that humans are not only individuals, but also members of groups. And besides the individual mind, there is also a group psychism with as well its unconscious. I say sometimes as an example that we are staying in the water so that at least until our knees, part of our body is in fluid. So part of our mind is in the fluid of the group mind. Sometimes the group unconscious is a medium for the transgenerational transfer of common contents, as well as of not worked through traumas. I will use this word work through, which means to elaborate, to transform something in a mental representation, which is necessary to go on with this. Common founding historical myths, as well as group traumas, are often remembered in ceremonies and commemorations, where the group fosters its cohesion. Traumas that cannot yet be worked through may heavily hinder the activity of the individual and group psychology, provoking, besides pain, deformations of thinking and feeling, as well as of perception of reality, what may provoke or intensify political turmoil. We know that in conflicts, each part has his own reality, his own view on the how things are going on, how was the past, how was history, and they are rather different very often. In large groups, we may sometimes observe strong unconscious streams that drag individuals who identify with shared ideals, needs, religion, language, social class, fears. Very recently, such a strong stream, unconscious stream, we saw in the no-vax movement that went all around Europe and around the world and dragged a lot of people. Wars are group phenomena which provoke a sort of a psychic tsunami that messes up many reference points which are of basic importance for survival and psychic life. In wars, individuals are permeated and overwhelmed by psychic dynamics of groups that are tragically locked in a life or death struggle. It is extremely difficult to preserve the capacity to think and evaluate reality, as well as consequences of one's actions under such an enormous burden of emotions. Now, a few words about, let's say, the war mindset. I consider useful to use two concepts introduced by Melanie Klein, which are largely used in psychoanalysis, namely the paranoid-schizoid position and the depressive position, two basic mindsets between which human psyche oscillates. Their basic features are the following, but these are like if in a computer we do push a click and things on the screen are arranged in a different way. So we have two reality that we see in a different, with different feelings, different anxiety, and so I would try to mention this, describe this. In the more mature depressive position, one may more realistically recognize in himself good and bad features, recognizing similar characteristics in his opponent as well. Therefore, it is possible to feel him more similar, a human with whom it is possible to identify with. Empathy helps to protect the other, without being a rival. In the subject, if the subject damages somebody, he feels guilt and need for reparation. Feelings of guilt or powerful restraints that hinder also the capacity to kill. In the group context, the depressive position is also characterized by a higher awareness of one's own individual uniqueness, as well as of the other's life value. This makes it more difficult to take risks or to sacrifice one's own or others' life. When the prospect of war looms, the group can no longer contain and mitigate the anxieties in its members. Under the strain of such an excessive emotional burden, the group can regress from the depressive to the paranoid-schizoid position. Now, let's see a bit what is this paranoid-schizoid position. it could be roughly related to the black and white thinking. What is white, what is good is connected to me, what is bad is connected to the enemy. Nothing bad in me, nothing good in the enemy. The massive projection of one's own negativity into the enemy and the denial of any good feature in him create an image of the adversary as much as possible evil. The enemy, so evil, is less and less felt as a human counterpart. Empathy is not anymore possible. And so dehumanized, he is not safeguarded by the taboo against killing. In fact, killing enemies becomes socially approved and praiseworthy. This is how paranoid anxiety subverts the scales of values. The concern for one's own survival predominates, while the possibility to feel concern for the other enemy disappears. The urge to act is reinforced at the detriment of thought. Destructiveness takes on a dignity that it never would in times of peace, and the fading away of sense of guilt opens the door to increasingly heinous crimes. In the paranoid-schizoid position, the psychic boundaries of individuals are weakened, and this helps the group's thought to penetrate the group members' minds. They assimilate with the dominant group psychic contents, though these are not screened or verified enough by the ego. This joins individuals together and still more increases merging with the group dominated by black-white paranoid-schizoid feelings. We so good, they so bad. The group comes together in a way that seems almost a primordial biological reaction. The loss of a significant level of mental autonomy on the part of the individual seems compensated by a greater participation in the identity of the group. A stronger we compensates for a weakened I. A fatal attraction is created between the individual and the group. In the end, fighting for the group or fighting for oneself largely coincides. Identified with the group, many become eager to sacrifice themselves to save the group. Military training is carried out in this paranoid-schizoid mindset because the capacity to engage in combat tends to dissolve in the depressive position. In extreme paranoid-schizoid position, the image of the enemy is so deformed that he could not either be felt as a human being, but is felt as a Negro, an enemy of the working class, a communist, a fascist, a Jew, a peace, and may be killed and even tortured and raped, like a puppet without any mercy. A few years ago, during Congress, many years ago, a psychoanalyst from Israel told about a young patient he had that during the analysis went to fight during one of the wars with Arabs. And coming back, this young man told that in the fight with his rifle, he pointed an Arab who was rather close, not so far. But he said, when I saw his face, he was resembling my schoolmate, my friend. At this moment, something in me changed, and I felt that he was a human being, that he was a young man like me, and I couldn't shoot him. You see, in this moment, in this soldier, the schizoparanoid position oscillated and changed in the depressive one, and his way of thinking changed. Actually, the paranoid-schizoid position seems particularly suited toward the survival of the species, groups or individuals in situations of danger, as well as of war. Evolution seems to have endowed human beings with a war mindset, which to some extent coincides with the paranoid-schizoid position. So in the face of danger, the depressive position fades and people slip to a defensive, liberating, narcissistic immersion within a group in the paranoid-schizoid position, where an intense sense of cohesion and strength provides a feeling of safety. I will quote the historian Peter Gay, what few lines that he wrote about the start of the First World War in August 1914. He wrote, "The most extraordinary thing about these calamitous events was less that they happened than how they were received. Europeans of all stripes joined in greeting the advent of war with a fervor bordering on a religious experience. Aristocrats, bourgeois, workers and farmers, reactionaries, liberals and radicals, cosmopolitan, chauvinists and particularists, fierce soldiers, preoccupied scholars, and gentle theologians, all linked arms in their bellicose delight." It was a general relief. Oh, at the end, Austria had declared war to Serbia and so on. The strength with which a group in the paranoid-schizoid position imposes its own position on individuals would explain why so many honest and sane people, many more than later we would like to admit, were drawn into, or at least allow themselves to be neutralized and dulled by the formidable magnetic pull created during the last century by extreme paranoid-schizoid positions like communism, fascism, Nazism were, but also by fanatic nationalistic or religious group. Very few managed to resist the incredible influence on thought and feeling of the mentioned ideologies. Naturally, the degree and pervasiveness of this regression varies depending on the type of wars, their different periods, and from individual to individual. In speaking of group regression, I'm in fact referring to the average level in which a group primarily functions. But let's give a look to the effect of war within the winding canyons of the mind. Eric Hobsbawm, the famous historian, considering the short century beginning in 1914 and ending in 1991, refers to it as the bloodiest century in recorded history. It produced 189 million deaths from wars, revolutions, genocides, and violent repressions, alongside the millions of wounded, crippled, orphaned, widowed, and displaced. It was the biggest catastrophe of the time that humanity exists. World War I counted 10 million deaths upon its conclusion. World War II claimed the lives of 56 million human beings. For its third act, the nuclear war, the world braced for its mega death, with calculations of human casualties in the millions. Fortunately, this danger, the last danger, was avoided for now, and humanity lived to see the end of this short century and the beginning of this following. Let us imagine some fragments of what took place place in the minds of those who took part in war. The two world wars produced an enormous amount of psychic trauma. Think only to what passed through the mind of a soldier as he leaped from the trench and exposed himself to almost certain death. Imagine the burden his psyche withstood in those endless minutes, deafened by gunfire and explosions, as he ran towards the enemy's machine gun fire, trampling over the wounded and dead comrades. And he likely did so less with a specific aim in mind than with the feeling of being part of a horde thrown into a furnace only to fill it up for others to trample over. How many of those moments and feelings can possibly be represented, reflected on, described, worked through, and integrated, we can say psychically digested by the survivors? And how many of them remain cocooned as if they were a shapeless stone in the corners of the mind? In the aftermath of the war, some attempted to tell these stories, to understand and make themselves understood, perhaps by writing a memoir in the attempt to work through a part of that horror. Here they may have been helped by the group solidarity, by the social recognition of shared suffering. But far too much trauma remained in the shadows and silence, confined to the minds of the individuals or to group unconscious with no way of being elaborated. This was particularly true for the defeated, who not only fell silent or were silenced, but were virtually expelled from the written history and intellectual life, if not to be catalogued in the role of enemy. We might say they were denied the right to be considered and therefore perhaps even to think themselves. In terms of individual and group psychology, during the war, the accumulation of trauma freezes part of the psychism in a functioning in the Paranoid-Schizoid position. This makes the activation of the depressive position more difficult during and after war too. Certain areas of the ego can recover a depressive position only by relegating unworked through traumatic contents into split areas. Even if the ego partially recovers the depressive position, it is weakened because the split parts of it cannot be used. Only by working through the trauma, functioning in the depressive position can be restored in these areas. When we speak of a group or an individual in the paranoid-schizoid position, we mean that functioning in this position is prevalent, but that functioning in the depressive is also unavoidably present, even if it may be reduced to such a degree that it is not longer evident. Even when we are submerged in paranoid-schizoid thoughts and feelings, there is always a part of us, however small, that perceives in the depressive position what is happening. Later, especially after the war, this may be regained and make itself felt. It might not be easy, however, to integrate these two stories of the same facts. These contents can neither be cancelled nor integrated, but one of these stories is instead repressed and ends up constituting a fragment of what I would call a secret parallel life becoming a source of painful psychic conflicts. Let's now consider that I will tell, I have killed. But it's not an easy thing to say, but neither to think. Because there is a disquieting question to pose. If during the world wars in the former century, more than 70 million human beings were killed, there must be millions of other human beings who did the killing. But we find barely a trace of this in records and memoirs. In diaries, letters from the front, the stories told at home, and the memoirs of the aftermath, hardly anyone mentions having killed the enemy or describes what he felt as he pushed a bayonet into his enemy's chest, staring into his bleeding eyes as they dimmed. How many millions of violations of the basic taboo to kill, and how much need to cleanse, atone, and manage distress and guilt has there been in this century? All of this horror has remained encapsulated like a bullet that is lodged in the brain. It is surely impossible to forget it in a single lifetime. At most, a person may try to repress it, but he can never tell anyone, nor can he work through it. Millions of individuals shall forever remain alone with such terrible burdens, transferring it silently to next generations. This is all the more true for the perpetrators of the most atrocious acts, especially if those acts involved civilians. Support is not possible from one's own group, which may have even commissioned those crimes, but is then unwilling to recognize them. This leaves the perpetrators of those atrocities alone. More often than not, a split space is created, another fragment of the, as I said, parallel life, where such devastating contents are secretly relegated. How much can these fragments, which are so alike, then resonate in the mental space of the group, influence it, and perpetuate themselves in the following generations? Yes, about transgenerational transfer. How does this happen? How do many contents pass unconsciously from one mind to another? This is a very interesting issue that concerns the breadth and richness of the psychic mechanisms, which we still only partially know. Anyhow, when the speech comes close to split or repressed traumatic issues, there appear factors like consciously unnoticeable pauses or silences, changes in voice tones, mimics, infra and metaverbal messages. Through years, the frequency of mentioning some issues may be less intense or lacking. Let us just think what intense effect may have when watching a movie. The background music stops, or just few musical notes may create a thriller tension in an absolutely pleasant scene. The image we have of a relationship with a significant person, like parents are, is like a puzzle composed by thousands of pieces. Some are more or less fixed, while many are perpetually changing. Unnoticed changes may significantly vary the emotional effect of the whole gestalt of this image. It is not easy for the therapeutic couple, patient and therapist, to discover such hidden paths that may lead to horrific unknown scenes. But what a benefit when these hidden bombs are deactivated. This is still more important because what happened decades or even centuries ago and is split or repressed remains saved as perpetual present, emotionally fresh, as if it would have just happened. It is astonishing how apparently extinct volcanoes may awake and erupt in destructive ways decades or even centuries later, as we could see, for example, in the relatively recent wars following the disintegration of Yugoslavia, or nowadays in the war in Ukraine. Some about the voids. At the end of the First World War, only 1 in 3 French soldiers returned home safe and sound. 1/4 of all enlisted students from Oxford perished in combat. During World War II, the main brunt of German aggression was unleashed on Soviet Union, whose population suffered the most devastating losses of all. 80% of Russian males from the class of 1923 died in conflict, 80%. And still, of course, there are the voids left by the Shoah and so on. What effects do these enormous voids, the war created in entire generations? My wife was Russian, and her mother told that after the war, she realized that all the male schoolmates died in war. No male survived from his school class, you see. What effects do these enormous voids, the war created in entire generations, have on the collective and individual psychology? What effects? The non-presence of the throngs of people exterminated continues long after to silently fill the minds and space surrounding the survivors. How does all this grief influence the group, together with the feelings of guilt held by the survivors in the face of those who perished? It is as if those voids, too, join with the millions of other contents of death and destruction that lie split and silent in the fragments of parallel lives. With their vibrations, they form a mute chorus that converge into the background soundtrack of the group's mental life. Now, let me do, let's say, a fiction on splitting, fragmentation, and reintegration. It's a fantasy, but maybe it has some elements, fragments of truth. Unworked through war traumas are relegated to the unconscious and to the known but not thought. They are stored in the minds of millions of individuals and possess so many similar and overlapping characteristics that they cannot help but spread throughout the psychism of the group, where mine, yours, his, all blend into ours. This protects the individual because he's not alone in this, but heavily conditions the group, the nation, in its functioning, its culture, and moreover, in terms of its future development and actions. So after the World War I, the group's mental fabric was so fully traumatized to be incapable to contain and neutralize such intolerable mental contents, which were so pervasive and present in so many individuals. Still, the disintegration of secular institutions like empires, monarchies, social orders contributed to further rising of temperatures and spreading of catastrophic anxieties. The nations as group containers were poisoned and progressively deformed. Massive non-elaborated parts imposed extreme paranoid schizoid defenses, where individuals could find relief through their common denial and external projection. Many groups had to deeply regress into paranoid schizoid position to actually psychotize themselves, to give some relief to traumatized individuals, members of their group. It is plausible then to think that something of this kind in the aftermath of the World War I contributed to the coming of World War II, maybe. If the climate is sufficiently free, as we might find in a democratic group, similar to the depressive position, then the incessant interaction among the new emerging needs and the fragments of the past structures tend to continuously form more suitable aggregation integrations. These then evolve, although they might involve recurring crises and tumult. However, these crises tend to be less violent since the ongoing adaptation should protect the group from catastrophic explosions, fragmentations, bloody revolutions. In a rigid defensive structure, like this in a fixed paranoid schizoid position, the pressure created by accumulated unsatisfied needs might reach a dangerous and explosive intensity. Here, a single, more or less destructive fragmentation, revolution, or war could retrigger the restructuring mechanism that was previously curbed in the rigid paranoid defense. In absolute monarchies and dictatorships, where the paranoid schizoid position dominates, there doesn't appear to be sufficient space for development. Instead, the attempt to preserve the present prevails. When too many emerging repressed needs risk bringing about collapse, the paranoid position intensifies in order to control the growing catastrophic distress. So monarchical or dictatorial regimes seem to contain their own inevitable destruction within themselves from the outset. During World War I, we witnessed the breaking up of both group cultures as well as institutions, empires, monarchies, ideologies. Due to being seriously traumatized and psychotized by the war, these cultures and institutions were unable to use the fragments of their past to form anything other than monstrous integrations. In fact, after the First War, we saw as extremely aggressive and cruel totalitarian dictatorships assumed power: communism, fascism, Nazism. Although they existed within different ideological contexts, they all shared the common conviction that their planned death of millions would be a fair price to pay for the survivors to reach the promised earthly paradise. European democracies basically vanished, with the last examples found almost only in France and England. That being said, both of these declining empires could still shift a large part of their own aggression and destruction to their colonies. At this point, the paranoid idea that the war cleanses the nation reappeared. Fascism and Nazism immediately set about rearming and militarizing for a new war, while the Soviet communism of the 30s unleashes an incredibly destructive fury upon its own people. These monstrous integrations born out of the sea of blood were full of persecutory and catastrophic distress, of uncontrolled destructiveness, and their very self-destruction was inevitable. Self-destruction seems to have been incorporated within these ideologies from the beginning. The paranoid all or nothing, it is also a way in which in the paranoid schizoid position, all is felt, all or nothing, black or white, either total victory or defeat and self-destruction. This was particularly evident in Nazism, when, for example, Hitler already in March, in the beginning of 1945, gave the order to destroy Germany, the German industry in Germany. No intermediate position was possible. Communism too seems to have been raised with a time bomb at its foundations. And after its explosion in 1991, little to nothing was left. As now we can look at Putin's Russia as again a paranoid schizoid dictatorship that is just time limited. It will disappear in some time, but it can take decades. The integration following World War II had significantly greater traumas at its roots, and therefore potential for serious psychotic destructiveness, as clearly represented by the prospect of the thermonuclear war. At least apparently, however, a miracle happened. The threat of total destruction reached its climax and then seemed to freeze into the Cold War. Perhaps no one had been able to suggest a minimal credible hypothesis for a brighter future following the day after. Perhaps a healthy fear prevailed. After the catastrophes of the two world wars, did humanity realize its own potential for destruction and put it in check, at least in part? Or maybe decades of destruction had finally led to an attempt for reparation? At any rate, there were no more mobs clamoring for war, and the elements were different. On one side was the terrifying fear of total destruction. On the other, the expansion of democracy, where more self-conscious individuals were more aware of the precious nature of their own existence and were no longer inclined to sacrifice themselves for questionable ideologies. So we were gifted with 70 years of relative peace. Considering the increasing speed of our development, it is a rather long period. In truth, these integrations continuously occur with local wars and economic crises in very tragic but less catastrophic ways. The need for a significant new integration seems on the put toward realization. We have other challenges: computers, internet, globalization, new forms of economy, new powers, but also pollution, climate changing, concentration of richness. All these could be also seen through a view through a schizophrenic and depressive position. But I don't want to absolutize these two concepts. These are just metaphors that may be useful to think about. History carries on, and despite our persistent belief in the omnipotent illusion to have pulled back the veil on how things work, the unexpected twists and turns never cease to surprise us. And those surprises give us our first glimpse of completely new scenarios. Let us hope they will not be apocalyptic. Some few conclusive remarks. As a metaphor, the group psyche is like a mighty river that incessantly flows, dragging its contents through generations. Some contents may be brought on the surface and there transformed in thoughts and words, told and usefully elaborated. Other contents need to remain underwater, unconscious, or split for long periods before they emerge and be deactivated and transformed. It may require a transgenerational extension. So happens for many too traumatic contents that to be worked through is needed an increase of strength of the psychic structure of the individuals involved in them, and also the support of appropriate changes and evolution in the group culture. Sometimes periods of more generations are needed. I do an example. Just 1 century after the First World War, we saw how presidents of former fighting nations together honored the deaths and said, our poor boys who killed each other. Until for decades, almost a century, each was honoring only his heroes that killed the others. Now, at the end, are all poor boys. Sometimes periods of more generations are needed for this. In this case, trauma should be deposited in 1 or 2 or more descendants. These careers may suffer from this, and their lives may be conditioned by this mission without either knowing what is the matter. In some historical moments, this may affect a significant part of the population. Individuals may be helped by psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, or group psychoanalysts, while large groups, like nations are, may benefit from an elaboration done by culture, writers, poets, painters, movie directors, composers, as well as scientists, and not only humanistic ones. I think that it is a task of culture, and museums are an important part of this. It's a task to be attentive also to what is split or repressed, and to propose to the groups appropriate ways of dealing with so painful contexts full of anxieties. Not museums just to celebrate victories and heroes. Such are those connected to wars and traumas of the past. Victims, as well as aggressors from both pasts, should be helped to become conscious of what had happened and of what also others feel. The depressive position should be implemented. We must have a space in which to save the painful and shameful contents, also if we are not yet prepared to face them to the core. So as we lay down our dear deceased in those split places, like our cemeteries, to be able to continue to live in our homes, so each nation and humankind itself should have memorials and museums where to lay and visit periodically, not only what we have suffered, but also the horrors, the crimes we have committed, to work through them as this little by little becomes tolerable, and integrate them in a process of mourning of our image of ourselves. Memories should not be forgotten, but either not used as weapons against others. I think that this meeting is a step toward this. Therefore, I express my warm thanks to the organizers. Thanks.
How can I start? I can start by saying I thank you very, very much for this not only thought-provoking, but also very touching speech, which I think goes to the core of our superficiality when we address perpetrators and victims, not thinking about the mindsets of those who have done something, the traumas they suffer, the traumas which are passed on in generations. I had the urge to write what you were saying as quotes because I'm knowing I'm going to use them a lot in my work in the future, but luckily we have the recording, we have your speech. I thank you very, very much for this overview and at the same time detailed description of what is going on in us humans in war. And I have some questions, but I just want to check first to all of you, please any questions you have. We have a few minutes. I guess many of you need to digest this talk. But I would like to ask at least one question, Paolo. Then it's directly related what you said in the end. You said, of course, we also have to talk and address the millions of people. You were referring to the First and the Second World War and the millions who died, and as a consequence, millions took the lives of the people who died. If I start with these people who killed someone during a war, for example, the trauma they have faced, you said, I quote, encapsulated in their brains, in their bodies, that what they did, they can't talk to anyone, they try to suppress it, societies are punishing. So my first question would be, I have two questions. My first question would be, those who have been soldiers, those who have been Nazis, fascists, killed anyone for the cause of these wars which were going on, they can't talk about it, they suppress it. How large is the scale of guilt feeling? How important is guilt in this setting? Is the trauma related to what has happened, or also to what one has done, which one can't cope with? And if that would be the case, is it the local societies who punish even more strongly because of condemning what has happened in a general phrase without looking at the individual setting, what has happened? How can we address, is this a kind of double trauma, that you have the trauma from the war and in addition you have a guilt feeling maybe, which is even more increased by local societies and their reactions? It's a very complex question, but maybe you have some first thoughts about this.
Yes, I will say that first, for example, the perpetrators, they don't have anybody, no group with whom to be supported, where the victims soon form a lot of groups, and so on. The perpetrators are not necessarily some criminals or so on. For example, Wiesenthal wrote that the SS didn't accept among them criminals and so. They accepted, let's say, honest people whom to transform their, to be able to do extremely criminal things. But they were punishing very hardly if somebody were stealing something to them and so on. So they, you see, what does it mean? For example, that also in Argentina during the fascist regime in the 70s, the torturers, they were not taken from the criminals in Buenos Aires, favelas or so, but were just simple young boys from the villages who were enough naive to be transformed then in torturers. So many times perpetrators during the wars are people who are drawn in such a things without having a great, they don't volunteer there mostly, they are drawn there. So the feeling of the guilt is also very problematic, because to feel guilt, one must be able to support, to bear this. You see, the example, we know that mothers who kill their baby, very, very often, they then commit suicide. It's or commit suicide, or they become psychotic and live in a delusional dimension far from reality, because it's very difficult to live with such a guilt feeling, you see. So in this sense, also perpetrators have to be punished if they did something, but also supported psychologically to elaborate this, the trauma they have suffered. Of course, it doesn't mean that we have to privilege the perpetrators instead of the victims, but to accept that it is this. Huh?
Thank you very much. I could follow up, but we are running out of time. I have just a last question. I'm monitoring here the Q&A, but I can't see any other questions. So my last question would be, you have talked a little bit about briefly, but let's say all the millions of people who have killed someone during wars, our grandfathers, our fathers, of us who are still alive, who are second and third generation of these soldiers. And if our grandfathers, our fathers were not able to talk about what has happened of the reasons which you just explained, you said the trauma is passed on to the next generation. So my question, my very last question would be, never communicated, but something is passed on. So when we talk directly about the war mindset, when we directly talk about the war setting, which we now have discussed in the last question, what would you say, very simply said, because it's a surely complex procedures, but what is it exactly what the second or third generation feel, get transferred, however you want to call it? Is it a kind of being also guilty? Is it a kind of, you said already, guilt, you have to be able to understand guilt and perceive guilt, get a perception of guilt. What is it, the second and third generation?
Well, you see, the second and the third generation have, let's say, the opportunity to live in a surrounding which is not so poisoned by hate and paranoid hate against the enemy. And so that they can live in a more let's say, containing support. For example, what I mentioned, the president saying, "Poor our boys." It gives, if these boys not, but they are not anymore alive, but their grandchildren can feel, oh, maybe my grandfather was somebody who killed another one, but poor boy, my father, what was he compelled to do, drawn to do in this situation? And it could be a big relief also for the bearer of this guilt through generations and so on, and also to regret, of course, and to feel also part of guilt, but it could be bearable, not such to destroy the psychic, let's say, apparatus and compel to deny and so on.
Thank you very much. We have used our 10 minutes coffee break, and I think it was very, very well worth it. And Paolo, I thank you once more very much for your presentation. Thank you for being with us, and I will take your speech with me for my work in the future, and I'm sure many of my colleagues will. So thank you very much.